no attention to Cuthbert. It's not as complicated as it sounds. I promise. Let's check out the scene. See the buttons on the platforms in front of our good friend Connie? They activate the bridges that will take her to the next platform. At least that's what they're supposed to do. To get them working, you'll need to connect them to the gadgets that control them. You can't see gadgets when you're in play mode, but they let you do all sorts of useful things in edit mode. You can tell gadgets apart by their color and icons. Green gadgets are sensors and inputs. This one is what we call a trigger zone. It's one of the more versatile gadgets. It can trigger other gadgets in the scene. Like in this case, Connie standing on the button. Hi, Connie. If you select the gadget with X, you'll be able to see its detection zone. That's it, right there above the button. Press the circle button to deselect the trigger zone, and let's look at the next gadget. Pink gadgets are movers and outputs, meaning they make things happen in the scene. This particular gadget is a rotator, and it's connected to the first bridge. Click R3 to start time, and let's see what it does. Well, not a lot right now by the looks of it. That's because the rotator is switched off. You can tell because the gadget is dim at the moment. But if we connect these two gadgets together, we can turn the rotator on using the trigger zone. In the next step, I'll show you how. Before we start connecting things, make sure you can see both gadgets. You'll notice they have ports sticking out of their sides. Ports on the left are inputs, and the ones on the right are outputs. Hover over the output port on the trigger zone now. You'll see the word detected appear. That means that when the trigger zone detects something, this output will send a signal. Before it can send that signal to the rotator, though, we'll need to connect them with a wire. So hover over the detected output and press R2 or X. You'll notice your imp is now tethered to the port by a wire. Power ports have appeared on the gadgets too. It's these ports that switch gadgets on or off. OK, drag the wire over to the rotator gadget. Now hover over the power port at the bottom, then press R2 or X. Once the gadgets are connected, the wire will disappear automatically. That way, your scene won't get cluttered. After all, you don't want wires all over the place. You can see the wire again by hovering over either gadget. OK, time to test our connection out. So let's switch over to play mode in the options menu. That's more like it. Now the trigger zone detects Connie when she stands on the button and activates the rotator on the bridge. As soon as she steps off, the rotator stops working. You can use the button to get the bridge lined up with the platform. Once Connie can make it to the second platform, you can head back to edit mode and move on to the next step. Now that we've connected the rotator, let's take a look at the second platform.
See the yellow gadget on its side.
This gadget isn't a sensor or an output. It's called a microchip. Microchips are used to organize logic in scenes. You can think of them as boxes of gadgets and wires. Let's have a look inside. Hover over this one with your imp. Hold L1 and press X. It's just like scoping into a group of objects. This window is the microchip's canvas. And if these gadgets look familiar, it's because they're two rotators. Each one controls half of this jointed drawbridge. Try to connect the output from the trigger zone to the power ports on the rotators. You can create multiple wires from the same output. Or you can clone wires in the scene by holding L1, then grabbing them with R2. Clone the wire near the rotator to create a new wire from the trigger zone. Once you've connected the trigger zone to the second rotator, switch over to play mode and make sure it's all working. OK, jumping on the button now will activate the trigger zone and raise the drawbridge so that you jumping on the button, then grabbing them with R2. You can create multiple wires from the same output. Or you can clone wires in the scene by holding L1, then grabbing them with R2. Clone the wire near the rotator to create a new wire from the trigger zone. Once you've connected the trigger zone to the second rotator, switch over to play mode and make sure it's all working. OK, jumping on the button now will activate the trigger zone and raise the drawbridge so that you can cross over the jumping on the button, then grabbing them with R2. Clone the wire near the rotator to create a new wire from the trigger zone. Once you've connected the trigger zone to the second rotator, switch over to play mode and make sure it's all working. OK, jumping on the button now will activate the trigger zone and raise the drawbridge so that you can cross over the... Oh, wait a minute. The bridge has dropped down before Connie could cross. That's because the signal to the rotator stopped sending as soon as Connie stepped off the trigger zone. Switch back to edit mode and rewind time with L3. In the next step, I'll show you how to make signals stay on. Wait a minute. The bridge has dropped down before Connie could cross. That's because the signal to the rotator stopped sending as soon... Wait a minute. Jumping on, then grab... You can create multiple wires from the same output. Or you can clone wires in the scene by holding L1, then grabbing them with R2. Clone the wire near the rotator to create a new wire from the trigger zone. Once you've connected the trigger zone to the second rotator, switch over to play mode and make sure it's all working. OK, jumping on the button now will activate the trigger zone and raise the drawbridge so that you can cross over the... Oh, wait a minute. The bridge has dropped down before Connie could cross. That's because the signal to the rotator stopped sending as soon as Connie stepped off the trigger zone. Switch back to edit mode and rewind time with L3. In the next step, I'll show you how to make signals stay on. Now that we've connected the rotator, let's take a look at the second platform.
See the yellow gadget on its side.
Before we start... Connecting things, make sure you can see over to that. Pay no attention to Cuthbert. In this tutorial, you can tell because the gadget is dim at the moment. But if you can tell before we... Now that we've connected the rotator, let's take a look at the second platform.
See the yellow gadget on its side.
And if these gadgets... You can create multiple wires from the... Jumping on the button now will activate the trigger zone and raise the drawbridge so that you can cross over the... Oh, wait a minute. The bridge has dropped down before Connie could cross. That's because the signal to the rotator stopped sending as soon as Connie stepped off the trigger zone. Switch back to edit mode and rewind time with L3. In the next step, I'll show you how to make signals stay on. If we want the bridge to stay up, we'll need to add a gadget between the trigger zone and the rotator to keep it activated. We can do this with a counter. So let's go into the assembly menu. Press square to open it if it's closed. Select the gadgets menu with X. You'll find the counter in the logic and processing section. The gadgets in this menu take an input signal and change it in some way before sending it on. Go ahead and select the counter. Its icon is a tally counter. Now you can see the gadget on your imp. Hover over the microchip and it will snap to the canvas. Press R2 or X to stamp the counter onto the microchip, then press circle to unequip it. The counter gadget counts up or down whenever it receives a signal through its inputs. By default, it starts its count at 0 and has a target of 1. Once it reaches that target, it sends a constant signal through its counter-full output port. Before we connect it though, let's tidy up the wires connecting the trigger zone to the rotators. Just hover over them and press triangle to delete them. If it's closed. Select the Gadgets menu with X or IMP. Hover over the microchip and it will snap to the canvas. Press R2 or X to stamp the counter onto the microchip, then press circle to unequip it. The counter gadget counts up or down whenever it receives a signal through its inputs. By default, it starts its count at 0 and has a target of 1. Once it reaches that target, it sends a constant signal through its counter-full output port. Before we connect it though, Let's tidy up the wires connecting the trigger zone to the rotators. Just hover over them and press triangle to delete them. Now press R2 or X over the detected output of the trigger zone to create a new wire. Connect it to the increase count input port on the counter. That's the port with the plus sign icon. Now when the trigger zone is activated, the counter will go up to 1. And, this is the important part, it will stay at 1 even after the trigger zone deactivates. Now hover over the counter full output port of the counter. This port sends a signal when the counter reaches its target. Create a wire with R2 or X and connect it to one of the rotator's power ports. Then do the same for the other one. Time to switch to play mode and try out our new connections. When you're happy everything's working as it should, return to edit mode and move on to the next step. Just one more bridge for Connie to cross. As you can see, we have another microchip on the platform, so let's open it up. Hover over it with your imp, hold L1 and press X. Okay, looks like we have everything we need here. But Connie's an adventurer, so how about we make this last bridge more challenging? Adding a timer to the logic should get the adrenaline going. Once Connie activates the button, she'll only have a few seconds to cross before the bridge drops back down. Let's head back to the assembly menu. If it isn't already open, press square. Then go into the gadgets section. You'll find the timer in the same place as the counter, the logic and processing section. Its button has a clock face on it. Now go ahead and stamp the timer gadget onto the microchip with R2 or X. Then unequip it from your imp with the circle button. Now let's take a closer look at the timer's inputs and outputs. You can see their names by hovering over the ports. The first input is a start timer port. Once this receives a signal, it will start the clock. The second one is reset timer, which sets the time back to 0. Over on the output side, we have timer finished and timer output. Timer finished sends a signal when the timer reaches the required number. It's set to 5 seconds by default. Timer output is a little more sophisticated. The signal it sends represents the timer's current progress. If, let's say, it's only halfway to its target, the signal it sends will be half strength. So how do we connect this so the bridge only stays up for a few seconds? Well, we need the bridge to be raised while the timer is running. So create a wire on the timer output with R2 or X. Remember how we used the counter on the previous platform? We can use one here too. Just like before, connect the wire to the counter's increase count input. Then connect the counter full output to the rotator's power port. Time to see if it works. Click R3 to test it out. As you can see, since the timer isn't connected to a trigger yet, the clock starts ticking as soon as we play the scene. The bridge goes up, but doesn't drop down when the timer finishes. That can only mean one thing. There's a problem with the logic. If you'd like to figure it out for yourself, feel free to check the gadgets and see what's wrong. Or move on to the next step and we'll go through it together. But doesn't drop down once the timer isn't connected to the power port. Time to see if it works. Click R3 to test it out. As you can see, since the timer isn't connected to a trigger yet, the clock starts ticking as soon as we play the scene. The bridge goes up, but doesn't drop down when the timer finishes. That can only mean one thing. There's a problem with the logic. If you'd like to figure it out for yourself, feel free to check the gadgets and see what's wrong. Or move on to the next step and we'll go through it together. So let's take a look at why the bridge stayed up after the timer finished instead of going back down. Remember how we used the counter earlier to remember the signal from the trigger zone? Well, now it's remembering the signal from the timer, so we need to make it forget that once the timer finishes. Let's go over to the counter gadget. Hover over the inputs to see their names. This one here is reset count. It'll put the counter back to 0, which will turn off the rotator. So all we need to do is connect it to the timer, but to which output? Aha! There we go. We can use the timer finished output. Hover over it and create a wire with R2 or X. Then stretch the wire over to the counter and connect it to the reset count input. But we also need to reset the timer, otherwise the logic will only work once. So let's get another wire from the timer finished output and connect this one to the reset timer input. You'll recognize it by the rewind symbol on it. All we have left to do is to connect the trigger zone to the start timer port so Connie can activate it. Okay, that was a lot of connections. So before we test it out, let's go over the logic we've made. First, Connie activates the trigger zone, which sends a signal to start the timer. Once the clock starts running, the timer output becomes active. This tells the counter to count up. That then turns on the rotator and raises the bridge. Now this is where the really clever stuff kicks in. After 5 seconds, the timer finishes its count, which activates the timer finished output. This in turn resets the counter to 0, cutting the signal to the rotators and lowering the bridge. And let's not forget, it also resets the timer, so the logic can be triggered again if Connie didn't cross the bridge the first time. Isn't logic exhilarating? Take your time digesting all that. Logic is easier to read if you route your wires neatly. Grab wires with X to change their paths. You can also move the gadgets around by grabbing them with R2. Feel free to test it out in play mode, but don't leave the scene just yet. I have one more thing to show you. So, on the third platform, we've set up a timer that makes the bridge drop after 5 seconds. But I think that might be too easy for a seasoned pro like Connie. Let's make it a little bit more challenging. First, if you're in play mode, switch back to edit mode and rewind time with L3. Let's move in closer to the microchip with the timer. You can use the grab cam, R1, to move your view. Now I'll show you how to tweak a gadget's settings. Hover over the timer gadget, hold L1 and press square. This tweak menu contains the settings for the timer. Hover over the sliders and buttons to see their names. The top slider sets the target time for the timer. If we lower this setting, the bridge will stay up for a shorter time. To adjust the value, hover your imp over the slider, then hold X. Use your imp to drag the slider left or right. Set it to around 3 seconds. It doesn't have to be exact. If you're a stickler for precision, you can adjust the slider incrementally using the up and down directional buttons. Just hover your imp over the slider and press up or down to tweak the value. In fact, why don't we make things really interesting for Connie? Let's set it to 2.5 seconds. You can close the tweak menu now by selecting the cross in the top corner with X. Or you could use a shortcut. Just hold L1, then press circle while hovering over the menu to close it quickly. The same shortcut works for closing microchips. Give it a try now. Hold L1, then hover your imp over the microchip and press circle. Time to test out the scene in play mode. If you have any problems crossing that last bridge, you can always tweak the timer again in edit mode. Remember, you just hover over the gadget, hold L1 and press square to open its tweak menu. When you're all set, take Connie to the last platform and walk through the door to complete this tutorial.
Hi, I'm Mark, Creative Director of Media Molecule, and I'm going to present a simple masterclass that will hopefully help you use some of what you've learned so far and turn that into an entire game. I'm going to be focusing on a remix of the Dreamiverse Dash game. That means take a copy of something, mess around with it, which is always a really good way to learn. I will be reiterating some of the basics that you may have already learnt, but basics make for strong foundations, and strong foundations make for strong structures. Yes. So, first of all, try playing the game, get familiar with it, and when you get past the finish line, we'll dive in and start tinkering. Okay, let's start by making sure we feel comfortable navigating the space. So here's a quick reminder of how we do this. If you feel you're already a master at camera controls, then you can skip this step. Use the left stick to move forwards, backwards, left, or right. Okay, you should be confident about moving around with camera controls now. So let's start changing the actual scene. Before we do that though, you may have noticed lots of these little bright cubes scattered around. These are gadgets. We don't need to see them for now, so let's hide them. Go to the menu, find the Show Hide button, and make sure electronics are turned off. That'll make things a bit clearer. Okay, let's start changing the track layout. In this step, I'll be talking about deleting, moving, and cloning. If you feel you're already a master of these techniques, then feel free to skip this step. A really easy thing to do is just delete some bits. Position your imp tip over a module. You'll see it highlight to show which thing you're over, and then you can simply press the triangle button to delete it. You'll also find a delete tool in the menu. Remember, use the square button to show or hide the menu. In the Tools menu, you'll find the Delete tool, but I suggest you try to remember the shortcut buttons. It will make for a far more fluid experience, and this is a masterclass after all. Sometimes you'll notice these little white outlines that remain. These were added as an artistic choice using Paint mode after the various track modules were placed. If you want to learn more about painting, then check out the art tutorials. But for now, feel free to just delete them if you wish. It won't affect how the scene plays either way. And remember, you can use the left and right directional buttons to undo or redo your actions. We can also really easily move any of the pieces in the scene. Move is the default tool for the imp in edit mode. You'll know the imp has this tool equipped by the icon on its tip. You should see these 4 arrows. If you see something else, then you have another tool equipped, but you can easily lose it by pressing the circle button to get back to the move tool. So, to move something, position the imp tip over the bit you want to move, then press and hold R2 to grab it. Now you can move it. Note that you can still use the sticks to navigate the scene while holding an object. You can also select a bunch of things using the X button, and then move or delete them all at the same time. Just press X on each bit you want to select, or hold down X and swipe over all the bits you want to select. Press the circle button to unselect everything you've selected. Cloning things in the scene is a quick and easy way to start adding things. To do this, simply hold down L1. Remember, we treat L1 like a shift key on a computer keyboard. Then grab using R2 as before and move it. This will make a copy. To try out any of the changes you make, press the Options button to bring up the Options menu and select the Play Mode icon. Then we can test what we've just done. Press the Options button again and select Edit Mode to go back and make more changes. When coming back into Edit Mode from testing your scene, you can choose to rewind time so that everything is back in its starting state and the character is back in the starting position. So just press this button in the menu or use the L3 button for a shortcut. But you don't have to rewind time when you come back into edit mode. Sometimes it's useful to make modifications as you go along, switch back into play mode and carry on from where you left off. I suggest you have a little practice. Modify the scene a bit, move some things, copy some things, clone some things. And when you feel confident, we'll go on to the next step. Hello again. I know some of you out there like to be all neat and tidy, line things up, keep things at right angles, etc. If this is you, then you can use the various guides to make you feel less itchy. Grid Snap is most useful for this. Look in the menu under Guides. Turn on Grid Snap with X, and then you can make the grid coarser or finer. Now, when you move an object, you'll see that it snaps to a grid. Turning on Obey Auto Guides will also help with moving and placing stuff. It literally means behave as you do in the home space. Depending on which item you select, it will try to make it easier to place for you. This behaviour is determined by the creator of each individual item, with a gadget we'll discuss elsewhere. In most cases, it'll make the object align to the surface of other objects. Go ahead, have a practice at using the guides, then when you're ready, we'll move on to the next step. So, let's add some new objects to the scene without using the clone tool. If you can't see your menu, remember to press the square button to make it appear. For some new objects, we'll need to go and search the Dreamiverse. Do that by clicking this button on the assembly menu. You can go looking for whatever you want, but for the sake of this tutorial, we'll stick to the Dreamiverse collection. So make sure you're in there. Go in and choose a bounce pad with X. You can now stamp some objects into the scene using either X or R2, whichever you prefer. Let's turn on Obey Auto Guides, so it's easier to put these things on the floor. Go to the menu, select Guides, then Obey Auto Guides. Let's get another object, a balloon. Now, make sure all the guides are off and stamp a balloon in the air. Before I stamp it though, note that I can rotate it using the touchpad. Just slide your finger on the touchpad in different directions to rotate it. While we're on the subject of rotating, let me show some other ways to do this. Try grabbing something by holding R2, then use the touchpad to rotate it, just like we did before we stamped the balloon. Another way is to grab and hold with L2 instead of R2. You can now rotate the object using the motion sensor by physically rotating your controller. Note that it rotates around the point you grabbed with the imp tip. And finally, using the L2 grab method, you can also use the left and right sticks to rotate. If you rotate using the left and right sticks like this, the gyro method, by which I mean using the motion sensor, will be disabled until you re-grab. So go ahead, try putting some new elements into the scene. Once you're comfortable with this, you know all you need to know to go off and put some new scenes together. Go to Dream Shaping, start a new game scene, and use other people's objects and characters you find in the Dreamiverse. This will get you a long way. If you feel like learning some more though, stick around and hit Next when ready. So, by now you know how to build a scene from scratch. But let's explore a really quick and easy way to add some movement and bring your scenes to life. Let's animate a part of the track using Dream's very own special version of motion capture. Make sure time is paused and that you have rewound the scene. First off, find something you feel could do with a bit of movement in it. Then grab it with R2 and practice the movement you'd like it to do. Remember, you can use the left directional button to undo if you accidentally leave it in an odd place. Don't be too precious right now. We'll learn how to be more precise later on. Let's just get something moving to learn the principle. Okay, when you feel you've got a good idea of what movement you're going to do, open the menu. Hello again. Let's get a bit deeper now. Assuming you haven't gone triangle button mad and deleted everything in the scene, there will be some objects in there that you can modify in ways other than just deleting them or moving them. Let's find one of these bounce pads, for example. Let's turn on electronics, as we want to look at those now. If they aren't already visible, then go to the Show Hide on the menu and make sure electronics are turned on. Notice if you hover over the object you animated, you'll see the path that it follows. And the gadget the animation is in will throb. You can delete the gadget with the triangle button if you want, or leave it. It's up to you. Position your imp's tip over the object and select it with X. You'll then see these contextual buttons appear. This bounce pad isn't actually a single object. It's a few objects that have been grouped together. But we can go into this group to mess around with the individual members of it, much like going into a folder on a computer. Press this button to scope into the group. You'll notice everything else go grey and blurred, except the things in the group. Yes, some of these things are still colourful. They're a special case, which we'll ignore for now. Pressing the Hide Everything Else button will make it super clear what is in this group, as it will hide everything else. We are now scoped into this bounce pad, and you'll notice that a gadget has appeared, which was invisible before. Gadgets will hide themselves unless you are in the same scope as them. There are exceptions to this, but we don't need to concern ourselves with those right now. So, you can go back or leave this scope by pressing this button in the corner. You can also use a shortcut to scope in and out. Hover over the object, hold L1 and tap X. This will take us in. Holding L1 and tapping circle button will take us out. In, out, out. Don't, which was invisible group, as colourful and with the individual members of it, much like going into a folder on a computer. Press this button to scope into the group. You'll notice everything else go grey and blurred, except the things in the group. Yes, some of these things are still colourful. They're a special case, which we'll ignore for now. Pressing the Hide Everything Else button will make it super clear what is in this group, as it will hide everything else. We are now scoped into this bounce pad, and you'll notice that a gadget has appeared, which was invisible before. Gadgets will hide themselves unless you are in the same scope as them. There are exceptions to this, but we don't need to concern ourselves with those right now. So, you can go back or leave this scope by pressing this button in the corner. You can also use a shortcut to scope in and out. Hover over the object, hold L1 and tap X. This will take us in. Holding L1 and tapping circle button will take us out. In, out, shake it all about. So, make sure you are in the bounce pad scope. You should see this gadget, a microchip. You can recognise a microchip by this little symbol. We can look inside the guts of a microchip by either selecting it with X and using the Open Microchip button, or the symbol in the out. In, out, shake it all about. So, make sure you are in the bounce pad scope. You should see this gadget, a microchip. You can recognise a microchip by this little symbol. We can look inside the guts of a microchip by either selecting it with X and using the Open Microchip button, or by holding L1 and tapping X. This will tunnel us into the microchip and reveal some of its inner workings on its circuit board. It's possible you may be looking at the back of the circuit board when you first open it. If that happens, then simply move your camera to look at it from a better position. Or you can also use the L1 plus R1 trick on the circuit board to quickly zip to a better viewing position. We won't concern ourselves right now with everything on this circuit board. Let's just try changing the value on this slider using X. This will affect how high the bounce pad sends the character. Try ramping it up, and then switch to play mode to try it out. Remember, you've only changed one bounce pad though, not all of them, so try to remember which one you changed. Come back into edit mode and locate the bounce pad microchip that you left open. You can close a circuit board by pressing this little button in the corner, or by hovering the imp tip over the board itself and pressing the L1 and circle button shortcut. But feel free to leave it open if you wish. You can happily scope out of the bounce pad but leave the circuit board open. You won't need to scope in now to change the slider, but once closed, you'll have to scope in again to see the microchip and open it up. Lots of the items in this scene have a circuit board with a slider or two on them. So hunt around the scene, scope in, find them, experiment. Come back when you feel ready to learn some more. Did you come across any camera pointers or trigger zones in your explorations yet? No? Then let's find one. There should be one right near the start gate. Assuming you haven't deleted them all, they look like this. This is a trigger zone, and this is a camera pointer. Notice that when you hover your imp tip over either of these gadgets, a wire will appear. This shows us that they're connected to each other. A trigger zone is a way of saying, when something enters a certain area, do something. In this case, the trigger zone activates the camera pointer. When the cone character is in the trigger zone, a camera pointer will force the camera to look in a defined direction. If you select the trigger zone with the X button, then you'll see the area that it cares about. You might need to zoom out a bit to see it fully. If you position your imp tip over the green zone, you'll see that arrows appear. These show us that we can change the dimensions of the area. Just hold down R2 and drag. Press the circle button to deselect mountain. If you select the trigger zone with the X button, then you'll see the area that it cares about. You might need to zoom out a bit to see it fully. If you position your imp tip over the green zone, you'll see that arrows appear. These show us that we can change the dimensions of the area. Just hold down R2 and drag. Press the circle button to deselect the trigger zone. There is another way to change the parameters of a trigger zone that gives you more control, but I'll save that for another time. We'll keep it simple for now. If you now select the camera pointer, you'll see some arrows appear. These show you the way the gadget wants to make the camera look. If you grab the camera pointer gadget by holding L2 instead of R2, you'll be able to change the defined angle. Use either the sticks or motion sensor. If pointer, you'll see some arrows appear. These show you the way the gadget wants to make the camera look. If you grab the camera pointer gadget by holding L2 instead of R2, you'll be able to change the defined angle. Use either the sticks or motion sensor. Let's look over here, and we'll see a trigger zone that has multiple wires coming off it. We can trace these wires to see what they are connected to. Handy little tip. If you use the L1 plus R1 trick on a wire, it'll take you to the other end of it. Very handy. we can see that we are connected to this large microchip. We'll take a look in there later. The other two wires are connected to camera pointers. If there's more than one camera pointer connected to a trigger zone, then the camera will blend between the two defined angles, based on how close the character is to each one. It's also worth noting, if you have a camera pointer in a scene that isn't connected to a trigger zone, then it will be on all the time and take away a player's ability to manually control the camera angle. When you feel you've understood trigger zones and camera pointers, why not try adding your own somewhere? You'll find the bits you need under Gadgets in the menu. Trigger zones live in Sensors and Input. And camera pointers live in Cameras and Lighting. Simply stamp them into the scene and connect them like so. Grab this little port with X or R2 and connect it to the power port on the camera pointer. Have a little play, and when you feel you've got it, we can move on to the next step.